And how did you get to Hollywood to be a writer for television?
Well, that was, I never actually wanted, I liked watching television, but I never wanted to be a writer for television. It was not part of my dreams. I just wanted to write books. And it all had to do with commercial vagaries of the market. And actually with, there's a lot of truth to the old saying, it's not what you know, it's who you know, especially in Hollywood where contacts are a huge part of it. I was a science fiction writer in my early career, and I published a number of short stories. I was nominated for awards. I won some awards. 6 or 7 years into it, I wrote my first novel, which was pretty successful. Then I wrote a second novel in collaboration, and that was even more successful. And my third novel was a vampire novel that kind of broke out of the strict genre things, and that was yet even more successful. And I was getting higher and higher advances for all of these. And then I wrote my fourth novel, which was a book called The Armageddon Rag, which was a rock and roll mystery, dark fantasy kind of hybrid novel that my editors said, well, this is going to be it. This is your big breakthrough, the book. We're going to make this book a bestseller. And they paid me a 6-figure advance for it. And came up with this big advertising campaign to make it a bestseller, and it was great. I was looking forward to my, incipient career as a famous best-selling writer. The only problem was the book failed to best sell. In fact, it failed to sell at all. It became like my worst-selling book that I had ever written, and suddenly my career as a novelist was over. Because after that, I couldn't get arrested. I'd been like a hot rising writer for a number of years, and publishing is not unlike Hollywood in that it's not a profession. And I know you guys are film students and into this thing. It's not a profession built for security. If security is important to you, don't go into this profession because, you can be the hottest thing in town on Tuesday, and on Wednesday, nobody's going to return your calls. All those dear friends that you think you had that you've been having lunch. And that certainly happened to me. Suddenly, I couldn't sell another novel at any price. I thought, okay, well, the Armageddon Rag failed. I'll have to come down in my price. I won't get a 6-figure advance again, but I'll get like a high 5-figure advance like I did for Fever Dream. No. I'll get like a low 5-figure advance. No. By the end, I was willing to even listen to offers for a 4-figure advance, but nobody was offering anything because the book had sold so dismally. Got great reviews. But, oddly enough, this self-same book that destroyed my career in publishing also opened the door to Hollywood for me because my film agent showed it to another client of his, a guy named Phil DeGuerre. And Phil was a experienced television writer. He'd been on a number of shows as a staff writer and producer, and he'd recently gone on to do his own show, and he had a hit show called Simon and Simon that he had invented, and he was coming up with another show called Whiz Kids, one of the first shows about computer hackers, but what our agent, we had the same agent, Marvin, knew was that Phil was also a dead rock and roll guy, and he was a Deadhead, and he loved to go to Grateful Dead concerts. He knew all the Dead. He had backstage passes and things like that. And he knew the Rag would appeal to him, so he showed him Armageddon Rag, and indeed Phil did want to appeal. He wanted to get into feature film, so he optioned Armageddon Rag for a feature film. And he was going to write it himself, write the screenplay himself. He was going to direct it himself. And the first thing he did was fly me out to Los Angeles to talk to me about it. Now, I'd sold other options before. If you have a lot of books and short stories and they get any kind of attention, in those days especially, you'd find someone to option them in Hollywood. The world has changed a lot. We're talking now the early 80s. So it doesn't work quite the same way anymore. But in those days, these cheap options were all over. And I would have 4 or 5 or 6 of my short stories and things under option simultaneously. But normally they option it, they send you a check, You never actually met any of these people or talked to them. They didn't care. You were just the author of the original material. They didn't necessarily want to involve you in the process. But Phil did. And so he flew me out, and we had some meetings, and we discussed how we would do the Armageddon Rag, and a few tricky points about the novels and so forth. And I got to visit TV sets and watch him filming Simon and Simon, and watched him filming The Whiz Kids, which sort of was his Armageddon Rag that sank without a trace after a short time. But he was still hot enough so that I made that contact with Phil, and we remained friendly. So like a year or two passes, and suddenly CBS has said to Phil, well, we want to get another show from you. Simon is doing real well. What else do you got? And Phil says, I want to bring back Twilight Zone. I always loved Twilight Zone. And I said, oh, okay, well, sure, we own Twilight Zone. You can bring it back. So Phil ramped up to do Twilight Zone, and he turned to a lot of science fiction and fantasy prose writers, and called me up and said, hey, you ever think of doing writing for television, doing a Twilight Zone episode? And, since I was in fact, I had run out of money and was wondering how I was going to pay my mortgage and couldn't sell another book because of the failure of Armageddon Rag, I was eager to try this new thing. And I said, sure, I'll do some Twilight Zones. And I wrote a script for him, and led to another script, and et cetera, et cetera. And next thing I knew, I wound myself out as a staff writer, moving to L.A. for 6 weeks or so to work on the Twilight Zone staff.
And after that came Beauty and the Beast?
Yeah, there was 2 seasons of Twilight Zone, and a brief flirtation with Max Headroom was in there briefly, and then Beauty and the Beast for 3 years. And then 5 years in, development, which sometimes known as development hell. So all told, I spent about 10 years primarily working in Hollywood. I enjoyed my 10 years out in Hollywood. I learned a lot from it. It was very valuable to me in a number of ways, not only financially, where it certainly was helpful to me after the situation I'd found myself in after Armageddon Rag, but also, as a writer, I learned things. But there were also frustrations. There's no doubt that working in television and film requires a certain temperament and skills that prose writers, book writers don't necessarily need or often have. And I found that on both Twilight Zone and Beauty and the Beast, and even later in development. The thing that really, I think, drove me back to prose, there were a number of things, but one of them was the constant arguments with other people, the politics, the fighting of it. It's when I sit down to write Ice and Fire, I can just do the work, and ultimately I am the judge. Yes, I have editors, and my editors make suggestions to me. They say, well, we don't think this thing is working, and I give their words consideration, and I change things if I think they should be changed. But in television and film, of course, you've got all these people, the studio and the network and the standards and practices department, and the actors and the directors and the producers, and sometimes it's hard enough to do the good work, and then you do the good work, and then there's other people who want to mess around with it, or they have their own idea and all that. And so you have to have a temperament not only to do the good work, but to fight for your work. And I don't necessarily enjoy fighting. After I mean, I did it, and I defended my work as best I can, and I won some and I lost some. But after a while, some of it just wore me out. That if you know Beauty and the Beast, the show, we always wanted to do shows like this, character-based shows. I think from the very beginning, the network wanted us to be the Hulk. They wanted a much more formulaic show that was much more action-oriented, where Catherine would get in trouble every week, and Vincent would beast out and come to her rescue. And there are more shows that fit that criteria. I think you'll see in the first season, where, and they even said, well, can we... the Hulk, he always beasts out twice. He would beast out, or would Hulk out, as they called it, at the end of the second act, and then he would have a bigger Hulk act in the climax where he would solve the situation. And they really wanted us to do the same thing. Well, we'd like 2 beast out in episodes. And could we have less of the poetry reciting and all that? And, we wanted more of the character pieces and all that. And, of course, you're in a constant struggle depending on your ratings. The stronger your ratings are, the more you can do it the way you want. And the weaker your ratings are, the more help they will give you. We did pretty well the first season and a half. So by the second season, we were really doing the shows we wanted to do, and was kind of disregarding the network pressures. But they were still there waiting, and we were winning our time slot for the first season, and we weren't like a top 10 show or anything, but we were winning the time slot, which was very good. And then I think NBC, we were on CBS. NBC made a change up in the lineup opposite us, and they had a couple sitcoms on opposite us, and they replaced one of them with a new sitcom called I think it was Full House, and starring the Olsen twins, and this goddamn thing became a hit, and suddenly we were not winning our time slot anymore. And the network was coming more and more down on us of, oh, my God, you're losing your time slot. And, that's why I've always hated the Olsen twins. And still, due to this day.
You've given me another reason to.
That's right.
Were there things that you learned when you were writing, serial television that would inform your books later on?
Yeah, certainly. I mean, one of the structure of Song of Ice and Fire, with his viewpoint things and cutting between the viewpoints and all of them ending essentially with, I don't know, cliffhangers or interesting points, is a structure I learned in television. You won't see it in my earlier novels, but of course, working for network television, you have to have act breaks. And depending on the structure of the show, is it a four-act show? Is it 4 acts plus a teaser, or 5 acts, or is it a teaser and a tag, what have you? But you always have to go out on an act break before you go to the commercial, and it can be a cliffhanger. That's a good act break. It doesn't have to be. It can be just a twist point, or a new revelation, or a piece of information, or something is resolved. But it's if you watch Law and Order, it's always the da 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 moment, where right before the commercial, da 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 da, oh my God, something has changed here. And the idea is to bring you back after the commercial, of course, but it's a good way to end a chapter or an act. And sometimes it's pretty hard when you're designing your story to come up with those act breaks, but that's why you get the big bucks. And it certainly works in the books too. It's keeps people reading. They reach the end of the chapter and they want to know what happens to that character because they're engrossed in Tyrion. But gosh, there's not another Tyrion chapter for a while yet. First, they have to read this Arya chapter or this Jon Snow chapter before they finally get back to Tyrion. And those end. And by the time they finish the Arya chapter, there's kind of an act break there too, and that hopefully draws them back for the next one. So yes. And also, I think it helps your dialogue when working in television and you're actually hearing actors speaking your lines. I look at my earliest scripts and I would have people giving long speeches, that take up a substantial chunk of the page. And it's too much. You get much better readability and especially for contemporary audience, if the characters aren't giving speeches to each other but are having much shorter back and forth kind of dialogue.
And